April 8, 1943. The skies above northern France burn silver with sunlight and gunfire. A formation of B-17 flying fortresses grinds eastward, their engines trembling under the weight of bombs and flak scars. Below them, a handful of escort fighters struggle to hold formation. The new American brutes, known as Thunderbolts. From above, a pair of Messerschmitt Bf-109s dive through the clouds, their pilots laughing through oxygen masks. To them, the P-47 looks absurd. Too fat, too slow, too clumsy to ever be a threat. They roll in confidently. The first German fires. Then, the world erupts. The Jug, as its pilots call it, rolls over and spits fury. 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns ignite in perfect unison, hurling a wall of metal that shreds the sky. A Messerschmitt bursts into flame before its pilot even finishes his dive. In that instant, the laughter dies. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots realize this armored beast is not to be mocked. It's to be feared. The Americans had built something monstrous, and it had just found its voice. By late 1942, the air war over Europe had reached a brutal stalemate. The Royal Air Force bombed German cities by night. The U.S. Army Air Forces struck by day, and between those two rhythms of destruction, the Luftwaffe ruled the daylight skies. American bomber crews, the mighty 8th, were learning a cruel lesson over occupied France. Without proper fighter escort, courage meant very little. The flying fortresses, those mighty B-17s, could fly high and far. But their defensive guns couldn't hold off swarms of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs for long. By the time the bombers reached deep into Germany, their escorts had turned back, limited by range. The result was predictable. Dozens of bombers fell in flames before even reaching the target. Crews were incinerated, captured, or simply vanished into smoke over the Rhineland. Every week, the casualty lists grew longer. Every mission felt like a coin toss with death. At Air Force headquarters in Britain, generals knew something had to change. They needed a fighter that could fly higher than the Luftwaffe, faster than the bombers, and far enough to protect them all the way to Berlin and back. It was an impossible demand, until one man decided to build exactly that. Alexander Kartveli, a Georgian-born engineer working for Republic Aviation, had already seen what happened when an army entered a modern air war with the wrong machines. His first design, the P-35, had been promising, but underpowered. Now, with war raging, Kartveli was given a blank check by the U.S. Army Air Corps. His task? Design an interceptor unlike any before it. The result was a giant among fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was a monster of aluminum and fire, a 7-ton airframe wrapped around a single engine that seemed far too large for any fighter. Its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial that could deliver over 2,000 horsepower. With its massive turbocharger buried in the rear fuselage, the Thunderbolt looked ungainly, like a barrel with wings. But Kartveli wasn't chasing elegance. He was chasing power, altitude, and survivability. When the first prototypes took flight in May 1941, even test pilots were skeptical. It handled like a brick at low speeds. It drank fuel like a bomber. And on the ground, it was nearly too heavy to taxi. But in the air, especially above 25,000 feet, it became something else. The turbocharger gave it lungs of steel. It could climb into the thin stratosphere where Luftwaffe engines gasped for oxygen. Its speed in a dive broke records, and nearly its own airframe. Still, by the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the Thunderbolt was far from ready. Production was slow, costs were high, and most American pilots didn't believe this overweight experiment could ever outfly the Germans. When the first operational units arrived in Britain in early 1943, laughter filled the flight lines. British Spitfire pilots called it a milk bottle with wings. German intelligence dismissed it as an escort for bombers that needs an escort of its own. And the U.S. Army Air Forces? They didn't know what to think. The war, however, had no patience for opinion. The skies over Europe would decide if this strange brute was a mistake or a miracle, and soon it would face its first true test. The moment came as spring turned to summer, when American bombers began striking deeper into occupied Europe, and those heavy jugs were sent to guard them. What began as an experiment was about to become an education for both sides. The first Thunderbolts arrived in England in the spring of 1943, delivered to the newly formed 56th Fighter Group, under the command of Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke. Zemke was no ordinary officer. A veteran of the Eagle squadrons who had flown alongside the RAF, he understood both German tactics and British discipline. When he first saw the P-47 on the tarmac at King's Cliff, he stared in silence for a moment, then muttered to his men, "All right, boys, let's see if this beast can fly like it looks." It didn't, at least not right away. Pilots wrestled with the Thunderbolt's bulk. Takeoffs were tricky. The landing gear was narrow, prone to collapsing on rough fields. At high altitude, the cockpit filled with the deafening howl of the turbocharger. Communication systems froze. The fuel mixture was unpredictable. And then there was the weight, nearly twice that of the sleek British Spitfire or German Bf 109. In mock dogfights, the results were humiliating. The Spitfires outturned it with ease, the Mustangs outclimbed it, and the Luftwaffe, at least on paper, could outrun it. The nickname came naturally. The Jug. Some said it was short for Juggernaut. Others said it simply looked like a milk jug with wings. Either way, the name stuck. And so did the doubt. But beneath that doubt was something unseen. Something even its pilots hadn't yet discovered. Because the Thunderbolt's true strength wasn't in grace or agility, it was in momentum. At high altitudes, its turbo-supercharged engine gave it near unmatched performance. In a dive, it was nearly invincible. German pilots soon learned, too late, that chasing a P-47 downward meant suicide. The Jug could dive faster than anything else in the sky, gaining speed so rapidly that its controls stiffened from the pressure. It could also take punishment like no other. During early sorties over France, pilots began returning with stories that sounded impossible. 1. Thunderbolt limped home with half its tail shot away. Another made it back across the channel with a cylinder blown clean off its engine. And one, riddled, with over 200 holes, still landed safely, its pilot grinning under a cracked canopy. British ground crews were stunned. "You'd have to kill the pilot outright," one remarked, "because the airplane won't die." As missions continued, confidence replaced skepticism. Zemke's 56th Fighter Group began scoring kills. The Luftwaffe, used to cutting through unescorted bomber formations, now found itself harassed by these thick-bodied monsters that refused to fall apart. By mid-1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force started deploying Thunderbolts en masse for daylight escort duty. Their presence changed. The tone of every mission briefing, B-17er to crews no longer whispered about dying before reaching the target. They spoke of the new guardians above the clouds, those roaring silver shapes that dove into enemy formations like thunderbolts of vengeance. But the aircraft still had one fatal flaw: range, even with drop tanks. The Thunderbolt couldn't escort bombers all the way to Berlin. It had the speed and power to dominate, but not the endurance. This limitation would force American engineers and strategists to rethink air combat itself. The P-47's role began to evolve, from high-altitude escort to ground attack powerhouse. By late 1943, what had started as a controversial experiment was transforming into one of the deadliest tools in the Allied arsenal. And as the war intensified, its reputation would change forever, from the joke of the skies to the hammer of Europe. The laughter that once greeted it would fade, replaced by a growing unease inside Luftwaffe ready rooms, because the Americans had just proven that brute force, when perfected, could fly. And soon, they would unleash it. Every great war machine earns its reputation not through design alone, but through the way it transforms the battlefield. For the P-47 Thunderbolt, that transformation came through three defining angles: technological power, overwhelming firepower, and unbreakable survivability. The technological angle, power born of excess, the Thunderbolt was, at its heart, a mechanical paradox. It shouldn't have flown the way it did. Too large for a fighter, too fast for its weight, and too complex for mass production. Yet, what made it extraordinary was its Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row, 18-cylinder radial engine that could generate over 2,000 horsepower, coupled with a massive General Electric turbo-supercharger mounted behind the cockpit and connected through a maze of ducts and pipes. It could maintain full power even at 30,000 feet, where most engines gasped for oxygen. That technological trick gave American pilots a hidden advantage. While Luftwaffe engines like the Daimler-Benz DB605 began to wheeze above 25,000 feet, the P-47 still surged forward with raw, explosive thrust. Its climb rate wasn't elegant, but its dive speed was terrifying. Test pilots reported speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour in a vertical drop, faster than any German fighter could safely follow. If a P-47 was caught outnumbered, its best defense was simple: push the nose down and vanish in a streak of silver and thunder. The firepower angle. 8 voices of fury if its engine was the heart of the jug. Its 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns were its voice, and they spoke in fury. Mounted 4 per wing, synchronized to fire in devastating unison, each could spit 800 rounds per minute. Together, they hurled nearly 100 pounds of lead and incendiary metal through the air every second. In combat, a single half-second burst could turn an enemy fighter into debris. When used against ground targets, those same guns shredded trucks, locomotives, and tanks with equal brutality. German pilots quickly learned that one mistake, one moment in the Thunderbolt's gun sight, meant instant destruction. Oh, Luftwaffe! Ace once recalled seeing tracer lines from a P-47 coming toward him. It looked like 8 red-hot ropes stretching through the air. There was nowhere to hide. The 8-gun layout was more than intimidation. It was precision. American pilots trained to converge their fire at 300 yards, where those 8 streams of bullets crossed in a single concentrated cone. At that distance, the P-47's burst carried more kinetic energy than a small artillery shell. Few aircraft in history could match that combination of speed, mass, and firepower. The survivability angle, the jug that refused to die, perhaps. The Thunderbolt's most remarkable quality wasn't what it could destroy, but what it could endure. It was built like a tank with wings. Its cockpit was protected by thick armor plating. The radial engine, unlike inline German designs, could absorb tremendous damage and still function, because it had no vulnerable coolant system to rupture. There were stories, countless and true, of P-47s limping home on half an engine, or flying across the channel with wings riddled by 20mm shells. One pilot, Captain Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group famously survived an encounter that would have killed anyone else. His Thunderbolt was hit by over 200 rounds of cannon fire from an FW-199 oil splattered across his windscreen. Hydraulic fluid gushed into the cockpit. The canopy jammed shut, but the engine refused to quit. Johnson barely made it back to England. And later, when the ground crews counted the holes, they realized not one critical system had failed. From that day forward, the legend grew. The jug can take it. The jug will bring you home. Even ground crews began to treat the Thunderbolt like a living thing. Battered, loud, indestructible, and loyal. By the time summer of 1943 turned to autumn, the men who had once mocked the Thunderbolt were now depending on it with their lives. They began to fly it differently, not as a nimble duelist, but as a battering ram of the skies. And that change in mindset would alter the war's balance, because once the pilots learned how to harness its weight and fury, the Thunderbolt stopped defending bombers and started hunting the hunters. By the end of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt had evolved beyond its blueprints. It was no longer just a machine. It had become a philosophy of air combat. Overwhelm, endure, and strike back harder. To understand how, we must look through the human, tactical, and enemy perspectives that defined its rise. The human angle. Learning to trust the monster. Every pilot who first climbed into a P-47 faced the same feeling. Disbelief. The cockpit was enormous, like sitting inside a metal barrel. The wings stretched wide, the nose seemed endless, and the controls were heavy. It wasn't graceful like a Spitfire. It wasn't poetic like a Mustang, but once airborne, something changed. The roar of the R-2800 filled the pilot's chest. The vibrations became rhythm. The aircraft stopped feeling slow. It felt inevitable. Veteran pilots of the 56th Fighter Group began to develop tactics around its strengths. They used its dive speed to escape, its altitude to surprise, and its ruggedness to survive. Zemke drilled his men to avoid turning fights, and instead fight vertically, using gravity as their weapon. They called it boom and zoom. Climb high, dive fast, fire once, and disappear before the enemy could react. It was warfare distilled to pure aggression. No flourishes, no theatrics. Soon, the results spoke louder than any theory. The 56th became the top-scoring American fighter group in the European theater. Their Thunderbolts, once mocked, became symbols of power. And pilots who once doubted it began painting names across their fuselages with pride. Wicked Wench, Misfire, Tobolt Terror. Each name was a declaration. The jug was no joke. The tactical angle. Birth of the fighter-bomber. When bomber escort limitations became clear, the P-47 found a new destiny on the ground. Its sheer toughness made it the perfect fighter-bomber. A new breed of aircraft that could dive from the clouds, deliver heavy ordnance, and live to tell about it. Engineers modified the wings to carry bombs and rockets. By 1944, Thunderbolts were dropping 500-pound bombs, strafing trains, and annihilating German supply convoys. Its heavy weight, once a liability in air duels, became an asset in the dive. The jug could plummet straight down like a missile, release its payload with brutal precision, and claw back to altitude before enemy flak found its mark. British troops on the ground called them the Angels with Hammers. German soldiers, hearing the distinct whine of the turbocharger overhead, had another nickname, the Jabo. Short for Jagdbomber, it became the sound of dread across occupied Europe. No train, no truck, no retreating column was safe. Wherever the Thunderbolt appeared, Destruction followed, swift and unapologetic. The enemy's perspective, from mockery to fear for German pilots. The Thunderbolt was a curiosity at first, an ungainly giant that could be picked apart in a dogfight. But as 1943 turned to 1944, their laughter stopped. Reports from the front began to sound eerily similar. The American radial fighter does not fall when hit. Their firepower exceeds our armor. Avoid the dive. It cannot be. Caught. Even Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most respected commanders, acknowledged the shift. He described the Thunderbolt as an aircraft built around a gun platform, not a pilot. In the hands of aggressive American flyers, it became a skyborne anvil, absorbing punishment, delivering death, and its presence forced German tactics to change. Instead of attacking bombers at high altitude, many began retreating into the clouds, hoping to evade the incoming escorts, but there was no hiding for long. By 1944, the Thunderbolt had matured into an apex predator. It no longer played defense. It took control of the sky. The same pilots who had once looked down on it were now counting their kills in Thunderbolts shot down, and realizing those numbers weren't rising. When Luftwaffe mechanics found wrecked P-47s on the ground, they were often stunned. The armor had resisted fire that would have obliterated a 109. The engine block was still intact, and the pilot, more often than not, had already bailed out safely. The message was unmistakable. The Americans had built not a fighter, but a flying fortress in miniature. By the dawn of 1944, the Jug had earned its respect, not through beauty, but through brutality. It had proven that in the new age of industrial warfare, survival and firepower mattered more than grace. And soon, that philosophy would be tested in the most decisive battles of the European war. From the skies over Normandy to the heart of Germany itself, the Thunderbolt's roar would become the soundtrack of Allied vengeance. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe had become an iron storm. Allied bombers thundered eastward daily, and now, finally, they weren't alone. Behind and above them flew the unmistakable shapes of the P-47 Thunderbolts, thick-bodied, silver, and defiant. The war had shifted. The Americans were no longer testing an aircraft. They were unleashing a doctrine, the Great Gamble, deep escort over Germany. The missions over Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and Berlin had been nightmares months earlier, unescorted raids where bombers were slaughtered by hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters waiting over the target. Now, in March 1944, the Thunderbolts pushed further than ever before, fitted with new droppable fuel tanks that extended their reach. For the first time, P-47s escorted bombers deep into Germany. It was the Luftwaffe's worst fear realized. German controllers scrambled entire wings of Bf-109s and FW-190s to intercept. The sky became a maelstrom of contrails and cannon fire. At 25,000 feet, a squadron of Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group spotted black dots forming ahead. Bandits at 12 o'clock high. The Jug drivers rolled into attack formation, 4 abreast, their engines howling in unison. What followed was not a graceful dance of fighters. It was blunt force trauma at 400 miles per hour. The P-47s dove, 8 guns each roaring in harmony. Tracer fire filled the sky like molten rain. German formations broke apart under the storm. The first 190 exploded mid-turn. The second spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The Luftwaffe pilots tried to counterattack, but every traditional tactic failed. They couldn't outdive the Jug. They couldn't disable it with quick bursts. And when they tried to disengage, the Thunderbolts simply accelerated downhill, gaining speed faster than any plane in Europe. One German ace, Franz Stigler later recalled, "The American radial fighter came down like a hammer. One hit, and the sky lit up." The myth of the slow, clumsy P-47 was collapsing violently. The moment of reckoning during one of the most intense air battles over Emden on March 6, 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on Berlin. Over 800 bombers, protected by hundreds of Thunderbolts and the newly arriving P-51 Mustangs, crossed into German airspace. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had, over 600 fighters. It became one of the largest aerial battles in human history. As B-17s were hit by flak and cannon fire, Thunderbolts plunged into the fight, their 8 guns blazing at close range. The roar of the R-2800 drowned out radio chatter. Smoke trails streaked the sky from both sides. Captain Gabi Gabreski, flying his P-47D HVA, dove from 30,000 feet onto a group of FW-190s. His first burst disintegrated one. The second kill came seconds later. He broke away only when his guns jammed. From the heat, and his engine temperature was climbing beyond safe limits, he limped back to England with victory's smoke still curling off his wings. The Thunderbolts had done what few thought possible. They had escorted bombers to Berlin and back. Losses were heavy, but they had pierced the Luftwaffe's armor for the first time. In German ready rooms, the silence was heavy. The once supreme air defense force had met an opponent that could not only take a punch, but deliver one back with interest. The shift in the sky, by mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was bleeding. Fuel shortages, pilot losses, constant Allied raids on airfields, and now an enemy that refused to yield. The P-47's turbocharged engine gave it unmatched altitude control, making it the king of the upper atmosphere. Above 30,000 feet, it could dive faster than any plane alive, and still come home with holes big enough to crawl through. The Thunderbolt was now a statement, an airborne symbol of American industrial might and resilience, and it wasn't done yet, because just months later, when the world's largest amphibious invasion began on the beaches of Normandy, the Thunderbolt would trade the stratosphere for the mud and smoke below, and redefine its role once again. June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, had begun. While thousands of ships converged on the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts roared low over the channel, their bellies loaded with bombs and rockets. The jug had changed. Once a high-altitude interceptor, it was now a brutal, versatile war machine, the spearhead of tactical air power. From escort to executioner at dawn, Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force swept across the coastline. They weren't there to duel with Messerschmitts anymore. Their job was dirtier and far more decisive. They dove through clouds and flak, strafing German gun emplacements, cutting supply lines, shredding columns of trucks and tanks. Villages, crossroads, railways, all vanished under the fury of 50 caliber fire. Each plane carried 8 Browning M2s, capable of firing nearly 100 rounds per second. Multiply that by a full squadron, and you had a literal storm of lead raining down on German defenses. When tanks began rolling toward the beaches to push the Allies back into the sea, the P-47s dove at terrifying speed. Their wings flexing under the pressure. 8 guns opened fire. Armor-piercing. Rounds tore through the thinner top, plating of Panzerfoes and half-tracks. Some were finished with 500-pound bombs, others with HVAR rockets, leaving blackened metal husks smoking on the fields. The Thunderbolt became the angel of death for German armor. Its sound alone, that deep, rolling thunder of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 struck fear into retreating soldiers, and wherever the P-47s flew, the front lines moved forward. A new kind of air power. Normandy campaign revealed something revolutionary. Aircraft were no longer just support. They were strategy. Thunderbolts operated almost around the clock, flying up to 6 sorties a day. They hit trains, fuel convoys, bridges, anything that moved. British troops on the ground began to cheer whenever they heard the heavy drone of the Jug overhead. T-20s meant they weren't alone. It meant the enemy was about to vanish in smoke. By July 1944, Allied commanders reported that P-47 strikes had destroyed or damaged over 3,000 vehicles and hundreds of tanks. Even German tank commanders acknowledged their terror. One captured officer told his interrogators, "The Thunderbolt was not an airplane. It was a monster that hunted anything that moved." And that was exactly the point. The peak of power as the Allies pushed toward Paris, the Luftwaffe tried one final desperate stand. Small groups of FW-190s and Bf-109s appeared over France and Belgium, hoping to disrupt the low-flying Thunderbolts. But by now, the balance of skill and technology had flipped completely. Most Luftwaffe aces were gone, lost over Russia, Sicily, and the early defense of the Reich. In their place were young, undertrained pilots flying on dwindling fuel. Against them stood veteran, Thunderbolt squadrons with thousands of combat hours. The results were brutal. German fighters were shot down almost as soon as they were sighted, and when they weren't, they were chased mercilessly, the Jug diving faster than any German machine could follow. By August 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter arm was broken. The once dominant air force of Europe now hid in the forests, grounded by lack of fuel and parts. Meanwhile, the P-47 reigned supreme, switching seamlessly between bomber escort, tank buster, and air superiority roles, something no other aircraft of the war could truly claim. The irony was complete. The same German pilots who once mocked the Thunderbolt's bulk and shape were now fleeing from its shadow, if they were lucky enough to see it before their cockpit filled with smoke and flame. The Jug's true voice by the autumn of 1944. Thunderbolts filled the skies from Normandy to the Rhine. Their 50-caliber guns spoke with the same fury they always had. But now, that fury carried purpose. Each mission, each strafing run, each tank destroyed, all brought the Allies one step closer to victory in Europe. When the war finally reached Germany's heartland, the P-47s followed, hammering rail lines, power stations, and retreating troops. It wasn't elegant warfare. It was industrial destruction, relentless, mechanical, unstoppable. And in the midst of it all, those 8 guns kept singing, 8 voices of vengeance, born from metal, oil, and American persistence. 8 voices that turned mockery into fear. The German pilots had once laughed at the Thunderbolt. Now, when they saw it in the sun, they didn't think of laughter, only survival. When the guns finally fell silent over Europe in May 1945, the skies told their own story. Wrecked Messerschmitts lay scattered across meadows and airfields. Railway yards were twisted ruins. Fuel depots were smoking craters. And among the wreckage stood the unmistakable silhouette of the P-47 Thunderbolt. Scarred, oil-streaked, and triumphant. The Jug had earned its legend not through beauty, but through endurance. The unbreakable workhorse across the European theater, the numbers spoke louder than any propaganda. By the end of the war, over 15,600 Thunderbolts had rolled off American assembly lines. Together, they flew more than 746,000 combat sorties, dropping 132,000 tons of bombs. and firing 135 million rounds of ammunition. It wasn't the most glamorous plane. That title belonged to the sleek P-51 Mustang, but the P-47 carried the war's burden. Its pilots knew it too. They called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, because that's exactly what it was. Massive, unstoppable, and always ready for another fight. In combat, its thick radial engine and armored cockpit saved countless lives. Many pilots returned home in aircraft riddled with holes, their engines still growling as they touched down. The Thunderbolt could lose a cylinder, a wingtip, even part of its tail, and still bring its pilot home. Where other aircraft were delicate instruments, the Jug was a hammer, and in total war, hammers win, a machine that changed strategy for the Allied command. The P-47's success wasn't just a victory of engineering, it was a revelation in military thinking. Before the Thunderbolt, fighter planes were judged by agility and speed. Dogfighting was still romanticized, two pilots circling in graceful death spirals. The P-47 changed all of that. It proved that raw firepower, survivability, and versatility could outweigh maneuverability. It showed that a fighter could dominate the sky and destroy the ground below, that air superiority and close air support were not separate roles, but part of the same doctrine. By 1944, Allied forces were no longer just fighting battles. They were executing a coordinated, industrial campaign, a war of fuel, roads, and logistics, and the Thunderbolt was the perfect tool for it. When German panzer divisions tried to regroup, P-47s cut off their supply convoys. When retreating troops crowded highways, Thunderbolts turned those roads into rivers of flame. The enemy didn't just lose tanks and trucks. They lost their ability to move, to resupply, to fight. This wasn't air combat. It was air dominance. The price of power, but power came with cost. The U.S. Army Air Forces lost nearly 3,500 Thunderbolts in combat operations over Europe. Flak was merciless, and many low-flying attack runs ended in silence. Those who survived never forgot the sound of shrapnel rattling against the fuselage or the sudden flash of a wingman vanishing mid-dive. Yet even in loss, the Jug's reputation grew. Ground troops credited it with saving thousands of lives. General Eisenhower himself later said that without tactical air power, the D-Day landings might have failed entirely. Among Allied soldiers, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of protection, the heavy, thunderous guardian in the sky. By the time American forces crossed into Germany, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The same pilots who once mocked the Jug's size now faced the truth. They had underestimated not just a machine, but an entire industrial and tactical philosophy. The P-47 had done more than fight. It had changed how wars would be fought forever. And yet, its story wasn't quite finished. Because even after Europe was free, the Thunderbolt had one final chapter to write, in the skies over the Pacific. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over, but across the vast Pacific, the fight against Japan still raged on, and once again, the Thunderbolt answered the call. Shipped by the hundreds to island bases across Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, the P-47 proved that its strength wasn't bound by continent or climate. Under the blistering Pacific sun, it became the hammer of the island-hopping campaign, escorting B-29 bombers, obliterating Japanese fortifications, and hunting supply convoys hiding beneath jungle canopies. The same toughness that had saved pilots over France now saved them over the coral seas of Okinawa. Japanese anti-aircraft fire was fierce, but the P-47's rugged construction often brought men back who should never have survived. In one recorded case, a Thunderbolt returned to base with over 200 bullet holes, a missing cylinder, and part of its tail shredded. Yet the pilot lived. That was the Jug's nature. Indestructible, unyielding, utterly loyal to the man inside it. From warhorse to icon. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the P-47 had flown its last combat mission. But its legend was only beginning to take shape. In total, the Thunderbolt destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, most of them on the ground, and countless tanks, trains, and convoys. It became a cornerstone of Allied tactical air power, paving the way for modern close air support doctrines that still define Western air forces today. Yet for all its glory, the P-47 quietly stepped aside when peace returned. The Mustang, sleeker and more photogenic, took the spotlight in post-war films and memorials. But among those who fought and lived to tell their stories, there was no debate. When the bombs fell and the flak rose, every man on the ground wanted one sound above him, the thunder of a Jug's radial engine. Legacy in steel and memory. Even decades later, the Thunderbolt's spirit endures. Many of its airframes were sold or scrapped, yet a few were preserved, lovingly restored by enthusiasts who still feel the pulse of that 2,000-horsepower engine. At air shows, when one of those survivors roars to life, veterans often stop in silence. Their eyes follow the great silver plane as it climbs into the blue. Not sleek, not elegant, but mighty. Because the P-47 wasn't built to impress, it was built to endure. It taught the world that air superiority wasn't about beauty, it was about resilience. That victory didn't always belong to the fastest, but to the one that refused to break. The German pilots who once mocked it never forgot it. And long after the war ended, Luftwaffe veterans would speak its name, with a mix of respect and disbelief, we thought. It was too big to fight, one said. Then we learned it was too big to kill. In the aftermath of the greatest air war in history, the Thunderbolt stood as proof that American industry could take ridicule and turn it into dominance. That laughter could be answered with thunder. Its legacy wasn't just in the number of planes shot down or tanks destroyed. It was in the confidence it gave to every soldier, every airman, who looked to the skies and knew someone powerful was watching over them. And as the last echoes of that engine fade into history, one truth remains. The German pilots had laughed at the Thunderbolt. But when its 850 calibers spoke back, the sky itself remembered their silence. In every war, certain machines transcend their purpose. They cease to be just tools of destruction and become symbols of endurance, courage, and transformation. The P-47 Thunderbolt was one of them. It began as an unlikely hero, a bulky prototype mocked by engineers and dismissed by its own pilots. But within 2 years, it evolved into the war's Iron Guardian, a weapon forged not from elegance, but from sheer determination. Its thunder was the sound of Allied will. Mechanical, relentless, unbreakable. Every bullet fired, every bomb dropped, every sortie flown reflected a truth about the war itself. That victory didn't come from perfection, but from persistence. Where the Luftwaffe sought supremacy through finesse and precision, the Americans answered with mass, strength, and innovation. The Thunderbolt embodied that philosophy, the industrial revolution of air combat. It wasn't designed to dance in the clouds. It was built to own the sky. And it did. In the quiet years that followed, when the world rebuilt itself from ash and ruin, the P-47 became more than a relic of war. It became a reminder of what happens when underestimation meets resilience, when ridicule meets resolve. Its massive frame, its roaring engine, its wall of firepower, all told the same story. Mockery is fleeting. Strength endures. The German pilots once laughed when they saw its shape. But when the Jug's 850 calibers opened fire, the laughter was gone, and history had found another legend written in smoke and thunder.